Welcome to this episode of the Heartbeat for Hire podcast. I feature Olympians, CEOs, disruptors, authors, professional athletes, and the best of the best, where they share their stories of resilience with my lens on leadership and culture. Let's get started. Greetings and welcome to this episode of the Heartbeat for Hire podcast. 3 things you will learn from this episode: how you can make a bigger impact on the world. Number 2, what companies can do to step up and drive change. And number 3, how do you turn talk into action and make people accountable? Mick Sheldrick, Michael Sheldrick, is a policy entrepreneur, author, and the driving force behind the efforts of Global Citizen to end extreme poverty. He's a co-founder and chief policy impact and government affairs officer. He leads the organization's campaign to mobilize support from governments, businesses, and foundations. He's also the author of From Ideas to Impact, which is a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. His career has spanned the world of pop and policy. Michael has worked with an impressive roster of international artists such as Beyoncé, Coldplay, Idris and Sabrina Elba, Lady Gaga, Miley Cyrus, Priyanka Chopra, Rihanna, Usher, and so many more. He's produced some of the world's most impactful and social campaigns and events. And oh my gosh, this goes on and on and on. You have to read the whole thing. Mick, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Real pleasure to be on with you today.
The pleasure is all mine. So I start the show the same every time, and I ask, would you please share some of your story?
Yeah, well, look, everyone always asks you, why did you get involved? Why are you passionate about this issue? And I guess for me, it began going back to the start of high school. So I grew up on the other side of the world. I live in New York City now, but I grew up in Perth, Western Australia, the most isolated city in the world, literally the furthest point on the map from New York City. And when I started high school, I was that kid, first of all, who was incredibly uncoordinated at sports. And I know as an Australian, it's blasphemy to talk about not being good at sports because we're known for being our sport and prowess. If you saw us at the Olympics, um, but I was the kid who couldn't kick a footy in the right direction, right? Couldn't score a goal to save my life. And then I was also the kid who wasn't great at academics. I remember my teacher pointing out to my mom that Michael's bottom in the class isn't going to amount to anything. People thought, this guy's stupid, lazy, isn't going to achieve much, isn't going to get through high school, let alone get into college or university. And then I remember one day at school, halfway through my first year at high school, we went in class and we had to do this in-class assignment. And it was just when the movie Gladiators had come out with Russell Crowe. And I was passionate about history, so I threw my heart and soul into writing about Roman gladiators and didn't think much of it. I got home from school that day and my mum had this confused look on her face. And she said, there's a message for you on the answer machine, back in the days when we all had answer machines. And it was my year 8 teacher, Mr. Byrne. He was 24 years old. It was his first teaching gig. And he said, hi, Mrs. Sheldrick, I've noticed a change in Michael. Can you give me a call back? And I thought, well, that's kind of slightly
Worrisome.
that's it. Like, what have I done wrong, right? And the reason why mum had that confused look on her face is after years of being told Michael isn't going to amount to anything, Mr. Byrne said Michael had topped the class and we don't know how he did it. And the next day he said to me, you may not believe in yourself, but I believe in you. I think there's more to you than meets the eye. If you're willing to work hard, I will meet you halfway in the middle. So I thought, what the heck? If this guy's going to believe in me, I'll give it a go. And sure enough, second last day of school, Mr. Byrne drives past our house. He gets out and he said, listen, I have been doing final markups. I couldn't wait until tomorrow, so I thought I would come by and give this to you now. He said, well done, mate. And he gave me a certificate with this number 1 on it. And of course, 4 years later, now that my ambition had been unleashed, this sense of aspiration, oh, wow, okay, here's an opportunity here. And if you work hard, amazing things can happen. So I finished school in the top 1% of my state. Got into law school. And then, of course, everyone is like, oh, you know what, Michael, you're really intelligent. You can do all these things. And I thought, no, I'm not. No, I'm not, because I never forgot. And I still don't forget what it was like to be that kid at the start of high school and the difference that Mr. Byrne made in my life. And as I got into university, as I got into college, university, and learned about the injustices in the world, the inequities in the world, the kind of stupid poverty where millions of children don't even reach their fifth birthday, let alone get into school, I thought, well, what can I do about this? What can I contribute to really level the playing field and give other people the chance to, realize their potential? And so that was really how I got involved. That's my origin story. That's my why that drives me
Yeah.
again, campaigning against the injustices we see in the world.
I love that so much, Mick. And I think it just goes to show how important your words as a leader are, whether it's at work or it's a teacher or it's a parent. And, when someone says you're not going to amount to anything, that absence of belief is internalized pretty harshly. And you don't forget those words, but you also don't forget when somebody says, I believe in you, or I've got your back, now fly. And I can recall leaders that have done that for me, and I can recall leaders that have told me the opposite. And your performance can be in direct effect of either of those things. So, what took you from understanding and seeing injustice to I'm one person, but I think I can make big change? Talk us through that leap.
You know, once I was at college and I was looking at what I could do, one of the things I did discover I was good at, one of my few superpowers, if you like, was my ability to ask people for stuff in exchange for nothing necessarily in return. So I recall going around my old local shopping center or the mall and getting all this free stuff donated. I asked everyone in the bakery, McDonald's, the equivalent of Starbucks in Australia. And then at my old high school, we did a quiz night. We raised about $1,000 to help build a school in Papua New Guinea,
Mm.
which was all well and good. But then over the summers and winter breaks, when I had the opportunity to travel to India, Bangladesh, Timor-Leste, just north of Australia, you quickly realized, okay, it's one thing to help build bricks and mortar in a school, but who is paying the teacher's salary
Right.
365 days a year? Who is paying to have meals on the table
Yeah.
for these children because they may not otherwise have a chance to get a meal, a healthy, nutritious meal? And then who is paying if a child gets sick or a member of their family for healthcare? And then you extend that amongst all the other communities in need, and you quickly realize, okay, no amount of quiz nights or charity gala night dinners, no matter how fancy, is going to raise the billions needed to end extreme poverty.
Yeah.
And in extreme poverty is a systemic challenge and requires a systemic solution. So being back in Australia, meeting the other co-founders of what would become Global Citizen, it was right at the time that social media was just emerging as a force. And so we sought to leverage the power of social media and then indeed the power of popular culture to really say, okay, how can we build a movement around ending extreme poverty and affecting the policy change? In other words, unlocking the billions of dollars at scale from governments and businesses that's going to be needed to end extreme poverty. And within that, that quickly became the origins of what would become Global Citizen.
I mean, I remember back growing up in, 70s and 80s when, we had Band-Aid and we had, these big, all of the music stars coming together to end poverty and to, feed the world. It was USA for Africa. And I just remember, I mean, those songs are like still ringing in my ears. Seeing these people that I admire get behind something that was so important, it brought consciousness on issues that I didn't think about in my everyday life. So why is it important for people to think bigger beyond their own place? I mean, in the US, we're struggling with inflation. I mean, you live in New York, it's hella expensive in New York. I'm a New Yorker, I know this. So like why should we be thinking bigger? I mean, I know the answer, but I want to hear you say it.
I think quite simply because when we invest in ending extreme poverty, it lifts all boats, right? It's the same reason why when you invest in gender equality, if you remember the arguments for extending childcare,
Yeah.
pay parity, all of these things, the argument and the research and data play this out. society as a whole benefits, right? Women's economic empowerment is one of the best ways to pull an entire family or community out of extreme poverty. And whether you're investing in girls' education, whether you're investing in their sexual reproductive health and rights, whether you're making sure they have access to basics like period products so that they don't have to drop out of school when they first get their period. All of these things, right, benefit society as a whole. And I think all too often we tend to see, especially now, action against whether it's climate change, extreme poverty, we tend to see it as a zero-sum game where
Right.
someone's going to lose, it's going to come at our expense. And last week I was with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, and he is a former, I think he's a metal worker. He worked in factories, and he was talking about the fact that when he goes to factories today, particularly amongst young men, he tells them, listen, if we want to increase the number of jobs in manufacturing in Sweden, actually ending extreme poverty in Africa, lifting more people out of extreme poverty is going to create a bigger market for the goods you're
Right.
producing, which is going to lead to more jobs. And so when we look at Africa, which is a dynamic continent, a youth for continent, I think 70% of the continent is under the age of 30. And by the middle of this century, 1 in 4 people on the planet is going to be of African descent. There's huge potential there. And if we
Right.
invest, not only does it have the potential to lift millions, hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, but also it could benefit society as a whole globally around the world, especially if we do it in a sustainable way. So I think what I'm interested in is how can we use storytelling? How can we use
Mm.
popular culture, movement building to showcase that ending extreme poverty is a win-win, much like investing in gender equality and women's economic empowerment has been.
I love that answer. Thank you for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more. I think we've seen certainly Oprah was a really big voice for, shining a light on education and how education makes such a big difference. But let's pivot a little and talk about companies and why companies and how companies could be really kicking in something. And I know at least now I've never I don't remember a time where consumers understood that they were voting with their dollars more than they do now. And so when you are a company that gives back or invests, it looks good on you. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. Companies are really waking up to the fact that when you look at particularly young consumers, right? But consumers as a whole, actually, as we've become more educated about our social and environmental footprint, that consumers on a whole, really, as you say, voting with their wallets, right? Voting with their dollars. And I know from speaking to many chief marketing officers, I was at this dinner last week with a bunch of CMOs. And the thing that they pointed out is it's always young people who drive culture, right? And they drive the food we consume, the clothes we wear, the music we listen to. So often CMOs are looking at how they can speak to the youthful audience. They skew young because that's what's going to make them relevant. And so they're looking for ways to tell this story. But you can only do that if ultimately, when you lift up the hood of the vehicle, what you're actually selling is sustainable if it's actually done in the right way. There's only so much marketers can tell a story. Otherwise, you get greenwashing, right? And I think people have become quite attuned now to hearing claims and interrogating those claims and saying, does the reality reflect your rhetoric, right? Is the talk
Yeah.
being turned into action? And I think the good news is there's frameworks out there for how companies can be more sustainable. There's this great certification, the B Corp certification,
Yeah.
and apparently the number of companies that have become certified as a B Corp has more than doubled in the last 3 years. So we are seeing companies move into this and actually look at their supply chains and say, how can you address labor standards? How can you address reducing your carbon emissions? And by the way, not just companies. As you know, Global Citizen is the official charity partner of Coldplay, one of the biggest bands in the
Yeah.
world. And and they've really taken it upon themselves to say, well, yes, we can talk and we can advocate for our fans to do more, whether it's changing their consumption patterns, such as coming to our festivals by public transport, also how they voting for nature, and also using their voice to shift policy. But what can we also do through the power of our example? And Coldplay, with this tour, they reduced their emissions by 59% based on their last
Amazing.
tour. And the thing I love about it is they did it in a way without sabotaging one bit, the fans' experience. And they tell this story about how when you go to a Coldplay concert, they put on solar panels, you generate energy, kinetic energy through the dance floors, and this powers the show. And
That is
thanks to
so
them
cool.
and this incredible company called Show Power and contributions from this company, incredible company, Everland and Equitable Earth, the Global Citizen Festival we just did last month, that was entirely powered by battery storage for the first time. And I do think that that matters because I think right now, when people question, well, how can we make a difference? When you actually unpack and you see stories, not just of why we should care, but how we should care, and you break it down, it's actually inspiring. It's like, okay, we can break this
Love it.
down. We can fix this problem. And so I think companies are waking up to say, well, how can we actually tell the story? It's not glamorous, but how can we make it glamorous? The story of implementation, because that's going to inspire our consumers to also do more and also to be part of this change. And just one last story. A
Yeah,
few nights
go.
I was speaking at Parsons School of Design here in New York City, and it was about the role of fashion,
Oh,
policy, and regeneration. But one of the things that was pointed out to me is, okay, you have the big players in the fashion industry, and apparently the fashion industry contributes as much carbon emissions as almost the entirety of the United States as a whole. So
oof.
it's massive, right? And it's largely unregulated. But now you've got these smaller companies who are looking to produce fashion in a more regenerative way. We had this one woman, Runa Ray, on the panel who was actually looking at seaweed and algae and how you make interesting products as an alternative to plastic-based materials.
Sure.
And one thing these smaller producers was talking about is if we band together, if we go to Washington as a united voice and demand regulation, demand policy to level the playing field, then it's going to make it much more easier for them to both make a profit while also contributing and helping to defend both people and planet.
I love that there are so many things that you touch, Mick, with the work that you're doing. I mean, it's climate, it's poverty, it's fashion, it's music, it's there's so much. And even as going down to your diet, like someone told me recently, a few months ago, almond milk uses a lot of water, and a lot. And maybe you should consider oat milk instead. And I never really thought about it that way. And just kind of bringing awareness of something as small as that makes you pause, makes you think differently. You have an opportunity to make a choice. So, one of the things that bugs the crap out of me, and I'm sure you have an opinion on this, but when companies say, we're going to be carbon free by 2050, I'm like, you think that's some achievement? Like, that's
Yeah.
pathetic. How about do it in 2 years? Do it in four. Like, why do you need a quarter of a century to get yourself right? Like, talk about that because I think there's so much more that companies could be doing.
Yeah, so the last few years, you saw this explosion with companies, as you put it, claiming to be net zero by 2050,
Yeah.
right? And the reality is some, I'm sure, made this commitment and they thought, okay, this is a long time away.
Yeah.
Others actually did do the right thing and they accompanied these long-term targets with near-term targets. And what I mean by that is they set, and there's this wonderful initiative, it's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which I think in the absence of regulation comes probably closest to saying this is the best practice. This is the gold standard for what companies should adhere to. But basically, you had some companies saying, well, hold on, if we're to get to net zero by 2050 and do this in the best possible way, we need to be halving our emissions by 2030, right? That's what the science tells us we need to do collectively as a global society. And when you look at it like that, you're like, okay, hold on, we have to start making these changes
Changes
now.
now. Yeah.
And some of these companies have already done it. I've been told when you look at IBM, they've already made really significant annual reductions. I used the story of Coldplay, which I know isn't a company, they're a music band, but that 59% emission reduction, it is achievable. And
Yeah.
companies, when they do this, when they invest, they actually find, well, not only is this a good story to tell when it's credible and we show how this is done, but it also results in savings as well. And so I feel like you're now seeing a shift from the long-term targets. And as customers have also got more savvy and being like, wait, well, what does this mean right now? What action are you taking right now? To actually this era of implementation, right? And in the book, I talk about the crisis of implementation.
Yeah.
The thing that really excites me is how the conversation has actually changed. Companies are being forced to demonstrate what they're doing now. And some have responded to that in a really, really compelling way. And there's lots of examples out there of what companies can or indeed ought to be doing right now. So yes, there's greenwashing, but I also feel like because of the abundance of targets, you now also have regulators coming in, like in the European Union, and guys, you don't just get to say, make these wild claims without accountability here as well. And so you're seeing actually this inside track saying, okay, well, we better be focused on what we're actually doing, and that's what we need to be sharing.
So, what are just some small things that the listeners of this show could be doing to level up and to become a little more aware or to do their part?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the good thing is there's no shortage of ways we can make a difference, right? We can register to vote if you live in a country in which you can vote. We had the great Jane Goodall on Global Citizen stage last month. She did a Vote for Nature push. You can also volunteer your time, right? And there's many ways in the local community you can do that. You can also look at your own consumption habits. And whilst you might discount that, you might say, oh, look, what difference is that going to make? Much like with the Global Citizen Festival, us using battery storage as opposed to two more diesel generators. It's a drop in the ocean, granted,
Yeah.
but the power of the example can be exponential.
Yeah.
And if you look at what we did on stage at Global Citizen Festival, we had all these companies, other live events businesses, other musicians come in, and they're like, that's pretty cool. How do we do that with our music festivals as well? And then you get to scale. And this brings me to my next point, the power of conversation, sharing stories. I was told and I read by Catherine Hayhoe, who is a Texan-based climate communicator, arguably one of the best in the world. And she said only 8% of US households even talk about climate change a year.
Mm.
And not just talking about the problem, though, because then you're just raising awareness, and without solutions, that in itself can just drive people further into apathy and disillusionment. It's also about sharing conversations about solutions. So if you are doing something, if you are taking action, one of the best ways to motivate and distill a belief in others that their actions can make a difference, which we need right now, we need agency, is to share those stories, communicate stories of success. Don't be shy, don't hold back, because
Yeah.
that will inspire others. And then finally, and I guess this is what I wrote the book around, and it doesn't roll off the tongue, but policy change.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, to address these issues like extreme poverty, like climate change, I mean, this is systemic change. But the good news is we don't have to wait for those in government or in the corridors of power to save us. Whether you're a cultural icon like Taylor Swift, an everyday business owner, or an ordinary citizen in your community, we can all affect policy change. It's both human in terms of it impacts all of us, but also how we make policy, how we shape it, whether it's at the school level, the community level, the state level, the national level, or the global level. And so my book, if you like, provides 8 steps. I call it policy entrepreneurship, on how we can all begin to affect policy change in our lives and address the biggest issues of our time.
I absolutely love everything you just said. And oh, by the way, I worked at IBM for 23 years. And so I know that even when I was there, they were doing some pretty forward-thinking stuff. And when you can attend a concert and you can say this was done entirely on battery power or this was done the kinetically from our dance floor, that is something a consumer or a concert goer loves to talk about. And so when you can say I was part of something that gave back something good or contributed positively to the world, people like talking about that. So if you are a business owner or a company listening, think about that. That is a badge of honor your employees would be proud of and something you can say to investors, etc. So, okay, changing gears, what inspires you?
Look, I think, I had the pleasure of traveling around the world, and you have to be an optimist when you work in policy change because you're trying to inspire others to act.
Yeah.
So if you aren't optimistic, then they're not going to be motivated to act. But despite the negative headlines, day in, day out around the world, I've got the pleasure of meeting with some remarkable leaders, whether it's people like Prime Minister Mottley of Barbados, coal communities in Australia who are charting their own destiny towards clean energy, or incredible advocates in South Africa who is addressing the big challenge of period poverty. And all of these advocates show that change is possible and they're leading to real world impact in their constituents' lives. And so, I guess what inspires me is despite the headlines and despite the polls that we live in this age of despair, what many polls also show, and we track this, is majorities of people around the world, including in the US, still identify as global citizen. It might be a slim majority, but it's there. And so we have this window of opportunity to really tap into that sentiment and give people a way to take action. And we have to remember that hope is a verb, right? It requires doing to
Yeah.
bring it into reality. But when I was writing the book last year, I overheard this conversation with one of the guys involved in creating the Paris Agreement on climate change. And his daughter, who had heard him after many years talking about climate change, talking about what's going to happen, as she grew up, she finally turned around and she said to him, she said, "Dad, I hear you talking about these big issues out there. Are we actually going to be okay? Are we as a human species going to be okay?" And he turned around and he said, "You know what? We don't know the answer to that. We can't answer to that. But one thing I do know is as a result of the circumstances of you being born at this moment in time, you have the opportunity to, more than any previous generation before, live a profoundly meaningful life because the actions we take today is going to impact so many people going to be born in 5, 10, 15, 50 years' time. And we have the tools at our disposal in order to affect that positive change. So in many ways, it is a gift and it's an opportunity
Mm.
to be alive right now. And, it's up to us in terms of what we do. And so I guess it's the possibility of the difference and the impact our actions can have, the positive impact that gives me hope for the future,
Mm. All
makes me
right.
optimistic.
So, what would you like your legacy to be?
Uh, look, I, you know, if I can tell, excuse me, one final story.
Yeah.
So when I started writing this book, I found out, my wife and I found out that she was going to be pregnant with our first daughter, was pregnant with our first child. And so there was nothing like the pending birth of our daughter to like finish up and hurry up and finish the book, right? So I was
Yeah, there's not a lot of book writing with a newborn, so.
like, that's what everyone told me, right? Like, your life's going to be over. So make sure you finish writing this book. So she was due to be born November 30th last year. I think I finished the book on November 9, 7 a.m. in the
Woo!
morning, all-nighters, and I got it done. And I remember I did a photo with my wife, selfie, 7 a.m., just submitted this, and we're like, right, we've got this final 2-week period to go out and enjoy ourselves, go to Broadway show before our baby arrives. And I got a phone call from my mum. She works as an aged care nurse on the other side of the world back home in Australia. and she said, there's this older gentleman who's just walked in, checked himself in, and he remembers you. He said, I know your son, Michael. And I said, well, who are you talking about? And she said, his name is Len. And my mind went back 20 years ago to as I would finish high school, I would take my dog and I would walk her down the park at the end of a street. And there was always this older gentleman there, Len. He had two walking sticks and he had this dog. You couldn't forget this dog because he called the dog Tramp because it was literally resembled the dog from Lady and the
Lady and the
Tramp,
Tramp.
gray hair. And I was like, Len, I remember him, but Mum. And she goes, I know what you're going to say. He's 105 years old. And do you want to speak to him? And so there we were. And literally, I was FaceTiming Len. So talk about bridging to the past. I FaceTimed him on my mum's phone and I spoke to Len. So Len was born in England in 1917. On November the 11th, Remembrance Day, 1939, he gets married. The following year, 1940, when war breaks out in Europe, he heads over to France where the Nazi war machine is gathering storm, and he finds himself detached from his unit. And he tells me this one harrowing saying, which just sounds like if you want to talk about despair, this sounds like it to me. He's walking up a hill, he's looking down, and a great shadow comes over the grass. And he looks up thinking it's a cloud blocking out the sun. It's not, it's 200 Nazi planes flying above him, blocking out every inch of the sky. And he thinks he's a goner at that point. Somehow, remarkably, maybe because it's one guy, they fly past. And so he runs around the hill to this village. He says, I find an American car. I thought, you beauty. He gets in the car. He drives to the coast, the port of Calais. He gets on one of the last boats leaving France before it's overrun by the Nazis, goes through mine-infested waters, arrives back in England, and his commanding officer says, Len, I need you to take your only gun. You're the only soldier who can spare. Go to that village, rally the locals and defend it because we're expecting the enemy to parachute above us. So he goes to this village. Sure enough, planes are flying over, and he says he rallies everyone, pitchforks and all. And I said to him, I said, Len, hold on a sec. How did you maintain hope? Like, how did you think it was over at that moment? And I remember he said to me, and I still get chills whenever I think of this moment and what he said to me next. He said, no, we said to ourselves, we haven't got much, but we're not running away. We'll give it a go. We're not running away. We'll give it a go.
Hmm.
Well, I can tell you, like a few days after that, it turns out our daughter Mickey, everyone says, by the way, that your first child never comes early. That's a big lie because she came on November 20th. And so she was born. And a few days after that, December 6th, I get a phone call from my mom, and she said it was Len's 106th birthday, and his daughter had come in to see him. And he told her, I haven't got anything left to give. It's up to others to give it a go. And he passed away that night. I think about that story and I think about the crossover with his long life, 105 years, and our daughter Mickey's, the start of her life. And they crossed over for just 2 weeks, which in itself is very special. And I think of Len's words, we're not running away, we give it a go. And our generation has so much more at our disposal than his generation had.
Right.
And then I think back to what my daughter's generation might ask of us is, did we rise to the challenge and did we give it a go? Because at the end of the day, we don't know what's going to happen, but the best we can do is to give it a go. And so you asked me what my legacy is, and what I hope the legacy of all of us is that we rise to the challenge and we give it our best and we give it a go to address the biggest issues of our time.
That is brilliant. Thank you for sharing that story. So, Mick, what's next for you?
Well, look, I've been on this book tour, and by the way, if people want to read it, I've been told on Audible, if you listen at 1.6 speed, you can listen to it in under 4 hours, which is, just like a long car ride. So consider that. And I'm out there meeting some incredible entrepreneurs. I think Global Citizen will continue to expand, and we have some exciting announcements coming up, both in Africa and in Brazil with our work to defend the Amazon rainforest next year. So there's some exciting work, but honestly, for me personally, with this book, I'm currently writing a bonus chapter because I've been inspired by all the inbound I've been getting from people saying this principle resonates with me. And in particular, I've been inspired by purpose-driven entrepreneurs who are founding these incredible businesses, people producing alternatives to earplugs with and headphones with mycelium, to the world's first net zero mead, honey wine. And all of these entrepreneurs saying, listen, we need policy entrepreneurship because we need to level the playing field. And so I think I'm already thinking about, well, okay, how can I work more with these entrepreneurs to level the playing field and ensure that they can thrive? Because I think that's incredibly exciting and shows that, well, we can all do something at our level that inspires others to really change the world, despite how divided it is. So looking forward to more.
Really cool, Mick. And guys, please go get his book. The QR code's right on the screen. If you're not watching, you're listening, it'll be in the show notes. So you'll be able to get it that way. Thank you so much for being on the show. You have certainly inspired me. And I think everybody can make a difference. Everybody has an opportunity to make an impact. And you don't have to start with a giant policy change. Just start. Just do something. Get involved. It's important. It's our planet, and we've got to do better. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Heartbeat for Hire podcast. You've been a fantastic guest, Mick, and take care of each other. Go have a great day and lead with heart. Are you ready to elevate your leadership style and create an exceptional workplace that stands out from the crowd? I'm here to introduce you to a game-changing resource that will transform the way you lead and shape your company culture. It's time to embrace the power of top-down culture. This practical guide empowers your leadership for lasting success, helping you create a workplace where everyone thrives. Get top-down culture today, and let's reshape the future of leadership together. Thanks for listening to this episode of Heartbeat for Hire. I hope you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel or consider leaving a 5-star review and a great rating at Spotify or Apple. Thank you so much for your support. Have a great day.